My name is Ezekiel Thorne. I'm a wildlife disease specialist with the CDC who survived the first 48 hours of the alien nuclear apocalypse. What I witnessed changed everything we thought we knew about our world. The flashes came without warning. The aliens came next. I need to tell you exactly what happened, because your survival depends on it. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Ezekiel Thorne. Most people just call me Zeke. I never thought I would be making a recording like this, but I feel like someone needs to document what happened. What's still happening? I work, or worked, I guess, as a wildlife disease specialist with the CDC's Emerging Zoonotic Diseases Unit. My job was tracking diseases that jump from animals to humans. Turns out I should have been looking up at the sky instead of down at the dirt. This is day 6 since it all started. I'm recording from what used to be a mining company's emergency shelter about 40 miles outside of Whitefish, Montana. Power's running on solar backups. Don't know how long it'll last. If you're watching this, it means you survived too. Maybe what I learned in those first critical hours can help keep you alive. Before all this, I was investigating some unusual wildlife patterns in the northern Montana wilderness. Elk, deer, even the smaller mammals were exhibiting strange migratory behaviors, moving away from certain areas without any obvious predator presence. Birds abandoning nesting sites mid-season. At first we thought it might be related to climate shifts, but the patterns were too localized, too specific. My field partner, Dr. Eliza Chen, noticed it first in satellite imagery, perfectly circular areas that animals were avoiding. "It's like they know something we don't," she said. I remember laughing it off. She was always more intuitive than me, saw patterns where I needed hard data. We debated whether to flag it up the chain immediately or gather more evidence first. I pushed for more data. That decision haunts me now. The day before it happened, we detected unusual radiation readings in local water sources. Nothing immediately dangerous, but definitely abnormal. Our equipment kept giving inconsistent readings near certain rock formations. I documented everything meticulously. Force of habit. Those notes might be the only scientific record left of the world before it changed. That night, we saw the lights. Brilliant pulses in the sky that the local news attributed to atmospheric phenomena or military exercises. The military always makes for a convenient excuse, doesn't it? Everyone just nodded and went about their business. Even me. God, I should have recognized something was wrong. The wildlife knew. They always know first. I woke up early the next morning to news reports about escalating tensions between the major powers. Nothing new there. Political saber-rattling had become background noise over the last few years. I had breakfast at a diner in town. Everyone was talking about it, but nobody seemed genuinely concerned. Just another day in the never-ending cycle of global posturing. I got a call from CDC headquarters while I was paying my bill. They wanted immediate samples from the dead wildlife we'd been finding. The urgency in my supervisor's voice was unusual. They'd never fast-tracked wildlife samples before. When I asked why, she just said, "Orders from above." By mid-morning, I was back at our field lab analyzing tissue samples. What I found didn't make sense. Tiny metallic fragments embedded in the organ tissue of several specimens. Not lead or any common metal, something I couldn't identify with our portable equipment. The fragments had a strange iridescence under certain light conditions. I tried calling Eliza, who'd gone to check another site but couldn't get through. Cell service was spotty that day. I didn't think much of it then. That was the last normal moment I can remember. Standing in our field lab, holding a test tube up to the light, wondering about strange metal in dead animals. I was driving back from the lab when I saw the unusual amount of military aircraft overhead. In rural Montana, you notice these things. They were flying in patterns I'd never seen before, but my mind was still on those tissue samples. I even stopped to help a stranded motorist, an old man with a pickup truck that had overheated. We chatted briefly about the planes. "Government's up to something," he said. If only he knew how right and wrong he was at the same time. It happened at exactly 3:17 in the afternoon. I know because I checked my watch right after. The horizon to the northeast lit up with a flash so bright it turned the day into negative for a split second. My first thought, ridiculous as it sounds now, was that I was witnessing some atmospheric research project gone wrong. The human mind tries to normalize the abnormal. It wasn't until I saw the mushroom cloud forming that the reality hit me. Nuclear detonation, somewhere near the Canadian border. Training kicked in immediately. I drove off the main road, found an abandoned mine entrance I'd documented during previous fieldwork. I barely made it inside before the shockwave hit. The ground shook, dust filled the air, and the entrance partially collapsed behind me. For a moment, I thought I'd be buried alive, but the old mining tunnels held. I had my field kit with me, water purification tablets, emergency rations, first aid supplies, and most importantly, a radiation detector. Standard CDC field protocol for those of us working in remote areas. Never thought I'd actually need it for its intended purpose. The initial readings were high, but not immediately lethal. I went deeper into the mine shaft. Cell service was completely gone now. The emergency radio in my kit picked up fragments of broadcasts, claims of accidental launches, terrorist attacks, retaliatory strikes. Nobody seemed to know what was actually happening, but one thing was clear. It wasn't isolated. Multiple strikes had occurred across North America. I spent 4 hours in that mine shaft, listening to increasingly panicked broadcasts until they gradually went silent one by one. When the radiation levels outside dropped to safer levels, I ventured out. The landscape had changed. Not just from blast damage, which was minimal this far from the detonation site, but something else. The sky had taken on a strange copper color. The air felt electrically charged. I tried reaching CDC headquarters repeatedly. Nothing. Then I tried Eliza's last known location. Still nothing. I was on my own with a head full of questions and a growing sense that what had happened wasn't what everyone thought it was. Those metallic fragments in the wildlife samples, the radiation patterns that didn't match standard nuclear fallout, the perfect circles that animals had been avoiding. I needed to move. Standing still after a nuclear event is never a good idea, both because of radiation drift patterns and desperate survivors. I'd plotted several emergency evacuation routes as part of my field preparations, another CDC protocol that suddenly felt inadequate for what was happening. The closest safe point would have been our regional field office in Kalispell, about 50 miles south. I had to try. My vehicle was still operational, thankfully. The EMP effects must have been partially shielded by the surrounding mountains. As I drove, I kept my radiation detector active on the passenger seat. The readings fluctuated wildly, not consistent with typical nuclear fallout patterns. In some areas, the levels would spike without any visible source, then drop again 100 yards later. Something was very wrong with the radiation distribution. About 10 miles down the road, I encountered my first fellow survivor, a park ranger named Marshall who was directing a small family away from the blast zone. When I stopped and identified myself as CDC, his expression changed immediately. "You people knew this was coming, didn't you?" he accused, hand moving toward his sidearm. I showed him my radiation detector, explained the unusual patterns. "Whatever this is, it's not behaving like normal fallout," I told him. That caught his attention. Marshall had a working emergency radio. We listened together as scattered reports came in, nuclear detonations across multiple continents, not just North America. This wasn't a localized conflict. It was global. And yet, there was no clear aggressor or target pattern, just seemingly random strikes. "It doesn't make strategic sense," Marshall said, echoing my own thoughts. That's when we saw it. At first, I thought it was a military response vehicle, some kind of specialized aircraft sent to assess the damage. It moved silently across the sky, triangular in shape, with a faint luminescence that seemed to absorb rather than emit light. It was heading directly toward the detonation site. "What the hell is that?" Marshall whispered. I had no answer. But when I checked my radiation detector, the needle was pinned at maximum. Whatever it was either heavily irradiated or generating radiation itself. We watched as it hovered over the mushroom cloud for several minutes, then descended into it. My scientific mind struggled to process what I was seeing. No aircraft could survive those radiation levels. No human crew, certainly. "We need to get these people to shelter," I said to Marshall, nodding toward the family huddled in his vehicle. "And I need to get to the CDC outpost." Marshall agreed to escort the family to an emergency shelter he knew about, while I continued toward Kalispell. Before we parted, he grabbed my arm. "If you find out what those things are, you come find me," he said. I promised I would, though I had no idea if I could keep that promise. As I drove south, I saw two more of the triangular craft. They all followed the same pattern, heading toward nuclear detonation sites. By now, I was forming a hypothesis, one so disturbing I could barely allow myself to consider it. These weren't response vehicles. They weren't ours at all. The first radio broadcast to name them came about 5 hours after the initial detonation. A ham radio operator in Idaho, voice shaking, described harvester ships collecting material from irradiated zones. "They're taking everything," he said. "Metal, concrete, even the soil itself." The broadcast cut off mid-sentence. I reached a roadblock about 20 miles outside Kalispell. Not military, not police, just scared citizens who had barricaded the road with vehicles. Their leader, a woman with what looked like medical training based on the equipment she carried, approached my vehicle cautiously. "CDC," I said, showing my identification. "I need to get to our field office." "There's nothing left of it," she said flatly. One of those things hovered over it for an hour. When it left, the building was just gone. Not destroyed, gone. Like it had been surgically removed from the ground. My stomach dropped. The field office had been my only hope for establishing communication with CDC headquarters, for making sense of what was happening. And now, it was gone, along with anyone who might have been inside. The woman introduced herself as Rebecca, a nurse from the local hospital. She had gathered about 20 survivors who were seeking refuge in an old Cold War bunker she knew about from her grandfather. When she heard I was CDC, specifically focusing on animal-to-human disease transmission, she became intensely interested. "The animals knew," she said, echoing Eliza's words from just days ago. 3 days before the blasts, every pet in town went crazy. Dogs wouldn't stop barking at the sky. Cats disappeared. Even the lab animals at the hospital research center broke out of their cages. This confirmed my earlier observations about wildlife behavior. Animals sensing something humans couldn't detect. It wasn't unusual. They can detect earthquakes, storms, and other natural phenomena before we can. But what had they detected this time? Rebecca's group had gathered some supplies, including a shortwave radio. We picked up fragments of broadcasts from across the country, each more disturbing than the last. Reports of harvesting operations in irradiated zones, strange structures being built where nuclear strikes had hit. military responses failing as weapon systems mysteriously malfunctioned near the triangular craft. One broadcast in particular chilled me. A scientist from what sounded like a government facility described the nuclear exchange as triggered rather than initiated. According to him, something had interfered with launch control systems worldwide, causing synchronized launches targeting specific locations. Locations that, he claimed, corresponded to underground anomalies detected by geological surveys years earlier. The broadcast cut off, but the implication was clear. The nuclear weapons hadn't been aimed at human targets at all. They'd been aimed at something buried in the earth. Whether as an attack or an awakening, I couldn't tell. I shared my findings about the metallic fragments in wildlife tissue with Rebecca. She confirmed seeing similar fragments in human patients in the weeks leading up to the event. Unusual metallic inclusions that showed up on X-rays, but couldn't be extracted surgically because they seemed to move within the tissue. "We thought it was some kind of new bioweapon testing," she said. "CDC was supposed to send someone to investigate next week." Too late, I thought. Always too late. That night, we watched from the bunker's observation point as more triangular craft arrived. They moved with purpose, coordinating their harvesting activities across the landscape. The radiation levels continued to fluctuate wildly, but I noticed something significant. The craft seemed to be absorbing the radiation, reducing levels in some areas while increasing them in others. They were terraforming, I realized, changing our environment to suit them. By morning, I knew I needed to reach a more substantial CDC facility. The bunker offered temporary safety, but no means to analyze what was happening scientifically. The closest major CDC installation that might have survived was in Helena, about 175 miles away. Rebecca's group voted to stay put, but she gave me supplies and their best handheld radio. "Find out what they are," she said, "and how to kill them." I left before dawn the next morning, traveling on back roads to avoid both the increasingly common triangular craft and other survivors who might not be as organized as Rebecca's group. The landscape had changed dramatically overnight. Where there had once been forests and fields, now there were bare patches of earth, perfectly circular, as if cut out with precision tools. The same circular patterns the animals had been avoiding before the nuclear strikes. My radiation detector continued to show erratic readings. In some areas, particularly near these circular clearings, the levels were lethal. In others, surprisingly close by, they were nearly normal. This defied everything I knew about radiation dispersal. It was as if the radiation was being deliberately concentrated in some areas and cleared from others. About 30 miles into my journey, I spotted a vehicle I recognized. Eliza's field truck, abandoned on the side of a rural highway. I approached cautiously, weapon ready. The truck was empty, but her research notebook was still there, along with her sample collection kit. The last entry in her notebook sent a chill through me. Metal objects moving under the skin. Self-propelled? Microscopic analysis shows structures unlike any terrestrial alloy. Eliza had been seeing the same thing I had in our wildlife samples. But she'd taken her analysis further, noting that the metal fragments appeared to be active, not passive contaminants. In her final notes, she'd sketched what looked like a microscopic machine, some kind of nanoscale device with components that resembled both mechanical parts and biological structures. I gathered her notes and equipment. If I made it to Helena, these could be crucial. As I was preparing to leave, I noticed something else, a pattern of disturbed earth leading from her truck into the woods. Someone or something had been dragged away. I followed the trail cautiously for about 50 yards before it ended at one of those perfectly circular clearings. Whatever had happened to Eliza, I couldn't help her now. Back on the road, I tried scanning radio frequencies again. Most were static, but one military channel was still active. A National Guard unit was reporting engagement with non-terrestrial entities near Great Falls. They described humanoid figures emerging from the triangular craft, collecting samples, not just of materials, but of people. The transmission cut off abruptly with sounds of weapons fire. The implication was unmistakable now. Aliens. The word feels ridiculous saying it out loud, but what else could they be? Some non-human intelligence that had either been awakened by our nuclear weapons or had triggered them for their own purposes. By midday, I had reached a small town called Augusta. It appeared largely intact, but completely deserted. No bodies, no signs of battle or panic, just empty streets and buildings with doors left open, as if everyone had simply walked away. I stopped to refuel from the local gas station, manually pumping since the power was out. While there, I heard a sound that didn't belong. A faint, rhythmic humming. Not mechanical, almost like chanting. It was coming from the town's small park. Against my better judgment, I went to investigate. What I found was both fascinating and disturbing. About 20 people standing in a circle around one of the small circular clearings that had appeared everywhere. They were swaying slightly, all looking at the same spot on the ground. As I got closer, I could see their eyes, vacant, unfocused, and something else, a faint metallic gleam under the skin of their exposed arms and necks. The same metal fragments we'd been finding in wildlife tissue. I backed away slowly, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening. But I stepped on a branch that snapped loudly in the quiet town. As one, all 20 heads turned toward me. Their movements were synchronized, mechanical, and then they started walking toward me, still in perfect unison. I ran. There was no point trying to reason with them. Whatever they were now, they weren't fully human anymore. I made it back to my vehicle and sped away, watching in the rearview mirror as they returned to their circle once I was out of sight. This was a new development. Human bodies being controlled somehow by the metal fragments. It explained the empty town. The people hadn't fled. They'd been collected, repurposed. I thought about Eliza's final notes. Microscopic machines. Nanotechnology capable of interfacing with biological systems. The implications were horrifying. By evening, I was forced to stop and take shelter as a strange storm moved in. Not rain or snow, but a thick, particulate mist that reduced visibility to near zero. My radiation detector went wild when the mist hit, the needle swinging erratically. I sealed myself in the car, using my emergency air supply from my field kit. Through the mist, I could see faint luminescent shapes moving, tall, thin silhouettes that didn't move like humans. They appeared to be collecting samples from the environment, methodically moving through the area with purpose. I remained absolutely still, hoping the vehicle's metal frame would mask my heat signature or whatever they might be using to detect life. The mist and its strange visitors passed after about an hour. When I checked my radiation detector again, the readings had changed dramatically. The overall levels were lower, but concentrated in specific patterns that looked almost like writing when I mapped them on paper. Was this communication? Territorial marking? I couldn't tell. I used the brief window of clear weather to keep moving. Helena was still about 90 miles away, and I needed to reach it before whatever was happening in Augusta started happening everywhere. If the metal fragments I'd been tracking were some kind of nanotechnology capable of controlling hosts, then this wasn't just an invasion. It was an assimilation. As night fell, I had to travel without headlights to avoid detection. The landscape had become alien itself. Strange structures had begun to appear in the blast zones, tall, crystalline formations that pulsed with internal light. They reminded me of antenna arrays, or perhaps environmental processors of some kind. Whatever their purpose, they weren't built by human hands. I picked up another radio transmission around midnight, a different military channel, more organized than the last. They were coordinating something called Operation Blacklight, which seemed to involve establishing a defensive perimeter around certain key facilities. One of those facilities was the CDC installation in Helena. They mentioned that the visitors avoided areas with certain fungal growth patterns, particularly a strain of cordyceps fungus found in the region. This caught my attention immediately. Cordyceps is a parasitic fungus that infects insects, hijacking their nervous systems. Different strains affect different hosts with remarkable specificity. Could there be a terrestrial organism that affected these aliens the same way? It was a long shot, but the first potential weakness I'd heard mentioned. I made a detour to a research station I knew about that studied local fungal ecology. If there was a sample of this particular cordyceps strain there, it might prove valuable. The station was intact when I arrived, though obviously abandoned in haste. The power was out, but the specimen refrigerator had a backup generator that was still running. Inside, I found what I was looking for: cultures of various local fungal species, including 3 varieties of cordyceps. I took them all, along with the research notes. As I was leaving, I noticed something odd about the station's surroundings. A perfect ring around the building, where nothing alien had been built or harvested. Looking closer at the soil, I could see a fine network of fungal mycelia just below the surface. The researchers had been cultivating it around their facility, perhaps as part of their studies, and the aliens were avoiding it. I spent the night at the research station, studying the notes on the cordyceps varieties while monitoring radio transmissions. The researchers had been investigating the fungus as a potential biological control for invasive insect species. Their notes indicated that one particular strain, Cordyceps montana, a locally evolved variant, had shown unusual properties. Unlike most cordyceps species that target specific insect hosts, this one produced compounds that affected a broader spectrum of organisms, including some mammals in laboratory tests. More intriguing were the notes about its resistance to radiation. The researchers had exposed samples to various levels of radiation as part of testing for agricultural applications in contaminated areas. The fungus not only survived but seemed to thrive in radioactive environments, using the radiation somehow in its metabolic processes. This might explain why it was effective against our visitors, who seemed to manipulate radiation themselves. By morning, I had formulated a hypothesis. These aliens, whatever they were, had a biology that was vulnerable to this fungus. That's why they avoided areas where it grew. It wasn't definitive, but it was something, a potential defense, maybe even a weapon if we could cultivate it rapidly enough. I carefully packed several samples and the research notes. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something I'd missed in the dark: a small digital storage device labeled Confidential Project Harbinger, taped under the main research desk. I pocketed it without examining it. There would be time for that later if I reached Helena. The journey resumed at dawn. I had to detour several times to avoid what I now recognized as harvesting operations. The triangular craft had deployed smaller, drone-like objects that systematically stripped areas of specific resources: metals, certain minerals, and, disturbingly, organic matter. They seemed particularly interested in bodies of water, extracting something from them that left the water cloudy and depleted. Around noon, I encountered a military checkpoint, the first sign of organized human resistance I'd seen. 3 National Guard soldiers had established a monitoring post on a ridge overlooking a major highway. They were suspicious at first, but my CDC credentials and the information I'd gathered changed their attitude quickly. "We've been trying to figure out what these things want," said their sergeant, a woman named Rodriguez. "Command thinks they're terraforming, changing our environment to suit themselves." That aligned with my observations. I shared what I'd learned about the cordyceps fungus and the apparent aversion the aliens showed toward it. Rodriguez radioed this information to their command immediately. In return, she shared what military intelligence had pieced together. The nuclear launches appeared to have been triggered by coordinated cyber attacks on multiple countries' defense systems. Each missile had been redirected to specific targets, not cities or military installations, but seemingly random locations across the globe. These locations, they had discovered, corresponded to unusual geological formations detected by deep scanning satellites years earlier, but dismissed as natural phenomena. They were hiding, Rodriguez said. Buried deep. The nukes either woke them up or broke whatever was containing them. Either way, they're out now. She showed me satellite imagery from before the communication systems went down. The triangular craft were emerging from the ground at nuclear strike sites, rising from beneath the earth where they had apparently been dormant. How long they had been there, nobody knew. Centuries? Millennia? The implications were staggering. An advanced alien civilization had been beneath our feet all along, either hibernating or imprisoned. Rodriguez's unit had orders to escort key scientific personnel to designated safe zones, where research into countermeasures was being coordinated. As a CDC expert with knowledge of the fungal defense, I suddenly found myself a high-priority asset. They would escort me to Helena, where a joint military-scientific task force was gathering. We departed immediately, traveling in a military Humvee with better armor and communications equipment than my vehicle. As we drove, Rodriguez briefed me on what else they knew. The aliens appeared to be establishing a network of those crystalline structures I'd observed, creating a grid pattern across affected areas. Energy readings suggested they were drawing power from the residual radiation, accelerating their construction efforts in the most heavily irradiated zones. More disturbing were reports of human conscription, people being altered by the metallic nanoparticles and then put to work in harvesting operations. These altered humans retained some of their motor skills and knowledge, but seemed to operate under external control. They weren't being killed, just repurposed. Somehow that seemed worse. About 40 miles outside Helena, we encountered one of these conscripted work groups. About 30 people methodically dismantling a small rural hospital, removing equipment and supplies with mechanical efficiency. They worked silently, moving in coordination that was clearly not their own. Among them, I recognized a face, Dr. Eliza Chen, my field partner. I almost called out to her before Rodriguez stopped me. "They don't recognize anyone anymore," she said grimly. "We've tried." Watching Eliza move like an automaton, her skin showing the telltale metallic shimmer under the surface, I felt a surge of anger and determination. If the fungal samples I carried could help develop a defense or even a cure for this condition, I had to get them to Helena intact. We skirted around the work crew, taking a longer route through forest terrain. It slowed our progress, but kept us undetected. As we traveled, I examined the digital storage device I'd found at the research station. It contained classified documents about something called Project Harbinger, a government research initiative that had been studying unusual subterranean anomalies since 2017. The project had identified 7 locations worldwide where unusual material compositions had been detected deep underground. Material that didn't match any known terrestrial element. They had been monitoring these sites for years, detecting periodic energy fluctuations that suggested something active rather than passive deposits. The sites corresponded exactly to the locations targeted by the redirected nuclear missiles. Most disturbing was evidence that some government agencies had known something was down there and had been studying it secretly. There were even experiments with recovered materials, attempts to understand and replicate the unusual metallic substances found near the anomaly sites. The same substances that were now being found in affected wildlife and humans. "They knew," I said aloud. the realization hitting me. Some part of our government knew these things were down there. Rodriguez glanced at me. That would explain why certain military units received specialized equipment for non-terrestrial encounters months before this happened. Equipment that actually works against these things. This changed the narrative completely. And this wasn't just an unexpected alien awakening, it was a containment breach of something our governments had been aware of and studying. The nuclear exchange might have been engineered by the aliens to free themselves, but they couldn't have done it without the nuclear arsenals we so helpfully built and maintained. As we approached Helena, the landscape became increasingly militarized. Defensive positions had been established on surrounding ridges, equipped with unfamiliar weapon systems that must have been part of the specialized equipment Rodriguez mentioned. The city itself was largely evacuated, with only key infrastructure and research facilities still operational under heavy guard. The CDC facility was at the center of this defensive perimeter. It had been converted into a combined research and command center, with military and scientific personnel working side by side. When we arrived, I was immediately whisked into debriefing with a joint scientific committee eager to hear about the fungal samples and the information I'd gathered. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt a glimmer of hope. Here was organization, purpose, humans fighting back with our greatest weapons, intelligence and adaptability. The next phase of my journey would be different. No longer just about survival, but about finding a way to combat these invaders who had been hiding beneath our feet all along. The Helena CDC facility had transformed into something unrecognizable. What had once been sterile research laboratories were now combined military scientific operation centers. Hastily erected containment units housed samples of alien technology and affected biological specimens. Researchers in hazmat suits moved with urgent purpose, while military personnel maintained security with weapons I'd never seen before. Sleek, non-standard designs that emitted low humming sounds even at rest. I was debriefed by a joint committee headed by Dr. Amara Okafor, the CDC's leading expert on emerging biological threats, and Colonel Richard Vance, who commanded the military contingent. They listened intently as I shared everything: the wildlife behavior, the metallic fragments, the cordyceps fungus that the aliens seemed to avoid, and the documents from Project Harbinger. "We've suspected there was a biological vulnerability," Dr. Okafor said when I finished. "The fungal samples you've brought might be the breakthrough we need. They're the first concrete lead on a potential countermeasure." Colonel Vance was more interested in the Project Harbinger documents. "This confirms what some of us have suspected. Certain elements within government have been aware of these entities for years. The information was compartmentalized, kept even from military high command. They showed me what they'd learned while I'd been making my way to Helena. The aliens, they were calling them visitors in official communications, had established major processing centers at each nuclear strike site worldwide. These centers were producing both the triangular craft and the crystalline structures at an accelerating rate. Analysis suggested they were converting radioactive material into some kind of energy source that powered their technology. The nanoparticles found in affected humans and animals were confirmed to be technological, not biological. Microscopic machines that integrated with nervous systems, allowing the visitors to essentially hijack living organisms. These conscripted beings retained their physical capabilities and knowledge but lost all autonomy. They were being used primarily for collection and construction tasks, effectively a slave workforce. "The good news, if you can call it that," Dr. Okafor explained, "is that the nanotech seems to require regular reinforcement from the visitors. We've captured several affected individuals who were isolated from visitor contact, and after approximately 72 hours, the nanoparticles begin to break down. Some subjects have regained partial autonomy." This gave me hope for Eliza and others like her. If we could somehow interrupt the visitors' control and isolate affected people long enough, they might recover. But that would require pushing the visitors back first, something that no conventional military force had managed to accomplish so far. I was assigned lab space to work with a team studying the cordyceps samples. Initial tests confirmed my hypothesis. The fungus produced compounds that had a corrosive effect on the alien metals. When exposed to cultured cordyceps montana, samples of alien material recovered from crash sites began to degrade rapidly. The fungus wasn't just repelling the visitors, it was actively harmful to their technology and possibly to them directly. But there was a problem. Natural fungal growth was too slow to be tactically useful. We needed a way to weaponize it, to deliver the fungal compounds rapidly and in concentrated form. This became my primary focus as the second day since the initial nuclear exchange came to an end. That night, exhausted from continuous work, I was assigned quarters in what had once been administrative offices. As I lay on a cot trying to process everything that had happened, I heard a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, hurried footsteps. Something had changed. I found Colonel Vance in the command center reviewing satellite imagery with his staff. "We've detected a change in their behavior pattern," he explained when he saw me. "The visitors are converging on specific locations around the globe. They're gathering resources and conscripted workers at an accelerated rate." The imagery showed massive movements of triangular craft and ground forces toward what appeared to be construction sites for something much larger than the crystalline structures I'd seen before. These new constructions were circular, miles wide, with intricate internal geometries visible even from satellite altitude. "We think they're building launch facilities," Vance said grimly, "or arrival sites for something bigger coming from elsewhere." The implication was clear. What we'd seen so far might just be an advance party, preparing Earth for something worse. The timeline for developing countermeasures had just shrunk dramatically. By morning, I was back in the lab working with Dr. Okafor's team on the fungal weapon. We'd made progress overnight, isolating the specific compounds in cordyceps montana that affected the alien technology. These compounds could be synthesized artificially, allowing for faster production than growing the fungus itself. The delivery mechanism remained a challenge. Conventional dispersal methods like aerosols would be too slow-acting and difficult to target precisely. We needed something that would deliver a concentrated dose directly to visitor concentrations and their technology. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A military engineer named Specialist Zhang had been studying the alien nanoparticles and realized something crucial. They communicated with each other using specific electromagnetic frequencies. If we could replicate those frequencies, we might be able to deliver our fungal compounds using the visitor's own communication network. "It's like hijacking their internet," Zhang explained. "We use their signals to carry our payload." It was elegant and terrifying all at once. We would be attempting to hack an alien technological system we barely understood, using principles of terrestrial fungal biology against entities that had technology thousands of years beyond our own. The potential for catastrophic failure was enormous. But we had no choice. Satellite imagery showed the circular structures were now 30% complete and accelerating. Military strikes against visitor concentrations had proven ineffective. Conventional weapons were intercepted or disabled before they could reach their targets. The few specialized weapons that worked were too limited in number to make a strategic difference. I worked with Zhang to develop what we called a mycological payload, fungal compounds packaged with nanotech transmitters that could infiltrate the visitor communication network. It was desperate, improvised science, combining disciplines that had never been integrated before. But that's how humans have always survived: adaptation, improvisation, using whatever tools come to hand. The plan took shape rapidly. The military would create a diversion at one of the major construction sites, drawing visitor attention. Meanwhile, our mycological payload would be deployed via a retrofitted communication satellite that could broadcast on the frequencies the visitors used. If it worked, the fungal compounds would be transmitted through their entire network, affecting all connected technology simultaneously. As preparations accelerated, I finally had a moment to process what was happening on a personal level. In less than 48 hours, my world had transformed from tracking wildlife diseases to developing weapons against an alien invasion. People I knew, Eliza, Rebecca, and her group, the Ranger Marshal, were either conscripted, in hiding, or possibly dead. And I was part of a desperate plan that might be humanity's last chance at maintaining independence on our own planet. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing. But strangely, I felt more focused than I ever had in my life. My training as a disease specialist had prepared me for this in ways I couldn't have imagined. Tracking transmission vectors, developing countermeasures, understanding how biological systems interact with external threats. These skills were exactly what we needed now. The final preparations for Operation Blacklight, as they were calling our desperate counterattack, began at dawn of the third day. I had been awake for nearly 24 hours straight, working with Zhang and Dr. Okafor to perfect the mycological payload. We had succeeded in creating a self-replicating version of the cordyceps compound that could piggyback on the visitor's own communication frequencies. In theory, it would spread through their entire network once introduced, breaking down their technology from within. The military diversionary attack would target the largest construction site in North America, located where Denver once stood. The visitors had completely transformed the area, converting the city and surrounding landscape into one of their massive circular structures. Thermal imaging showed thousands of conscripted humans working there under visitor control. The thought that our attack might harm these people, innocent victims being used as tools, weighed heavily on all of us. We've modified the payload to minimize effects on organic tissue, Dr. Okafor assured me. It should target the nanoparticles without harming the human hosts. I hoped she was right. Looking at the satellite images of Denver, I couldn't help wondering if Eliza might be among those conscripted workers. The thought of her trapped in her own body, aware but unable to control her actions, haunted me. It made the mission personal in a way that transcended even the broader stakes of human survival. Colonel Vance gathered the key personnel for a final briefing before deployment. The plan had 3 phases. First, a conventional attack using our most advanced weapon systems to draw visitor attention and resources. Second, while their defenses were engaged, we would use a recovered and modified visitor communication node to introduce our mycological payload into their network. Third, special forces teams would move in to recover conscripted humans as the visitor control systems began to fail. Make no mistake, Vance told us, this is a desperate gamble, but it's the best one we've got. If those structures reach completion, whatever's coming next will make the last 48 hours look like a picnic. I was assigned to the second phase team, responsible for monitoring the payload deployment and making any necessary adjustments in real time. We would operate from a mobile command post positioned just outside the projected effect radius, close enough to maintain control of the operation, far enough to escape if things went catastrophically wrong. As we prepared to move out, Dr. Okafor pulled me aside. "There's something you should know," she said quietly. "The Project Harbinger files you recovered. They contained more than just information about the subterranean anomalies. There were experimental results from tests conducted with recovered visitor technology." She explained that years ago, government scientists had extracted samples of the metallic nanoparticles from the soil near anomaly sites. They had experimented with them, testing their effects on various organisms, including humans. These experiments had been conducted in secret, without oversight on unwitting test subjects. They were trying to harness the technology, she said, to weaponize it. They injected test subjects with diluted nanoparticles to see if they could be controlled. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Our own government had been experimenting with alien mind control technology. Had they inadvertently triggered the visitor awakening? Or had they simply been playing with forces they couldn't possibly understand, like children discovering their parents' loaded gun? There was no time to process this disturbing revelation. We moved out immediately, joining a convoy of armored vehicles heading toward the deployment zone. The landscape we traveled through was increasingly alien, forests and fields replaced by strange crystalline growths and perfectly circular clearings. The sky had taken on a permanent coppery tinge, and the air carried an electrical charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. We passed through several abandoned towns that showed signs of systematic harvesting. Buildings had been partially dismantled with specific materials removed: metals, certain types of stone, electronic components. It wasn't random destruction, it was methodical resource extraction. The visitors knew exactly what they needed and took only that, leaving the rest intact but useless. About 15 miles from the Denver construction site, we established our command post in an abandoned mining facility. The underground structure offered some protection from detection, and the existing communication equipment could be adapted to our needs. Zhang and I set up the modified visitor communication node, a strange asymmetrical device that pulsed with internal light and seemed to shift slightly when not directly observed. "Are we sure this thing won't just alert them to our presence?" I asked as Zhang made final adjustments. "No," he admitted, "but we've isolated it from external networks until we're ready. In theory, they can't detect it until we activate it." Theory. So much of what we were doing was theoretical. We were applying human science to technology we barely comprehended, attempting to use biological weapons against entities that might not even be fully biological themselves. It felt like trying to hack a quantum computer with an abacus. The first phase began at precisely 12 noon. We watched on monitors as our most advanced aircraft and artillery opened fire on the Denver construction site. The weapons themselves were conventional: missiles, guided bombs, artillery shells, but they had been modified with the specialized technology that previous encounters had shown could penetrate visitor defenses. The initial strikes hit their targets, creating visible damage to the outer structures. The visitors responded immediately, triangular craft rising from the site in synchronized defensive formations. Our attack had achieved its primary objective, drawing their attention and resources away from their communication network. "Payload ready," Zhang announced, his fingers moving across the control panel of the modified communication node. "Broadcasting in 30 seconds. Those 30 seconds stretched into what felt like hours. On the monitors, we could see the battle intensifying. The visitors were now fully engaged, their defensive capabilities increasingly focused on our conventional attack. It was working, but at a terrible cost. Our forces were taking heavy casualties as the visitors deployed weapons that seemed to distort space itself around their targets. "Broadcasting now," Zhang said finally. The communication node pulsed brightly, emitting a high-pitched tone that made my teeth ache. On a secondary monitor, a visualization of the visitor communication network appeared. Countless interconnected nodes spanning the construction site and beyond, reaching toward other visitor concentrations across the continent. Our mycological payload appeared as a ripple in this network, spreading outward from our broadcast point. At first, the effect was subtle: minor disruptions in the pattern, small fluctuations in signal strength. Then, like a wave gaining momentum, the disruptions began to multiply and intensify. Nodes started to disconnect or show signs of degradation. The network was beginning to break down. "It's working, Doctor," Okafor whispered, watching the visualization with intense concentration. The fungal compounds are replicating and spreading through their system. On the battle monitors, we could see the first effects. Several triangular craft suddenly lost altitude, their smooth flight patterns becoming erratic. Structures within the construction site began to emit unusual pulses of light. The conscripted workers, previously moving with mechanical precision, started to show signs of disorganization. For a brief, beautiful moment, it seemed like our desperate plan was succeeding. The mycological payload was infiltrating the visitors' technology, breaking down their control systems just as we'd hoped. We had found their weakness and exploited it with the elegance that nature itself uses. A simple fungus bringing down an advanced alien civilization. Then, something changed. The visualization of the visitor network suddenly shifted, sections disconnecting and reforming in new patterns. It was as if they were quarantining affected portions of their system, cutting them off to prevent further spread of our payload. "They're adapting," Zhang said, fingers flying across his controls. "They're reconfiguring their network to isolate the infection." We watched in dismay as our advantage began to slip away. The visitors were learning, evolving their defenses in real time to counter our attack. It was a level of adaptability we hadn't anticipated, not just technological, but almost biological in its response to threat. The battle was reaching a critical phase. Our forces had penetrated to the intersections of the construction site, targeting what intelligence suggested were key control nodes. The visitors were now fully committed to defense, bringing more resources to bear with each passing minute. And our mycological payload, while still affecting some systems, was being systematically isolated and neutralized. We needed a new approach, and fast. Looking at the network visualization, I noticed something significant. The visitors were prioritizing certain nodes for protection, shifting resources to maintain their integrity even as they abandoned others. These must be their most critical systems, the ones they couldn't afford to lose. "Can we redirect the payload to target those specific nodes?" I asked Zhang, pointing to the protected sections of the network. He studied the pattern, then nodded slowly. "Yes, but we'd have to increase the broadcast power significantly. It might burn out our transmitter." "Do it," I said. "One concentrated strike at their core is better than a diffuse attack they can contain." Zhang reconfigured the transmitter while Dr. Okafor and I modified the payload to maximize its impact on the protected nodes. We were operating on instinct and adaptive reasoning now, beyond the boundaries of established science. The visitors were showing us how their systems worked through their defensive priorities, and we were learning in real time. "Ready for maximum power transmission," Zhang announced. "But I should warn you, this will absolutely reveal our location to them. We'll have minutes at most before they respond." Colonel Vance, who had been monitoring the battle, made the call. "Do it. We'll dispatch a rapid extraction team to your location immediately." Zhang activated the enhanced transmission. The communication node flared with intensity, the material of its construction seeming to partly phase out of normal space as it channeled more power than it was designed to handle. The visualization showed our concentrated payload striking directly at the visitor's protected nodes like a surgeon's scalpel targeting a vital organ. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The protected nodes began to destabilize, their connections to the wider network failing catastrophically. Unlike the gradual degradation we'd seen before, this was a systemic collapse that spread outward through connected systems. On the battle monitors, we could see visitor craft falling from the sky, their control systems failing simultaneously. The crystalline structures began to lose their coherence, sections crumbling or phasing partly out of our reality. Most significantly, the conscripted humans were stopping, the mechanical precision of their movements dissolving into confusion and disorientation. Some fell to their knees. Others stood swaying as if waking from deep sleep. The nanoparticles controlling them were failing. "We've done it, Doctor," Okafor breathed. "The fungal compound is disrupting their entire network." Our victory was short-lived. Almost immediately, our sensors detected multiple triangular craft changing course, abandoning the battle to converge on our location. They had traced our transmission and were responding with overwhelming force. "Extraction team is 10 minutes out," Colonel Vance informed us. "You need to hold position until they arrive." 10 minutes seemed an impossibly long time with alien craft closing in. John continued to monitor the network disruption, making adjustments to maintain the effect for as long as possible. The communication node was beginning to degrade, parts of it sublimating into acrid smoke as it overheated. "We need to preserve the research data," Dr. Okafor said, downloading everything to portable drives. "Even if we don't make it, others need to know how to replicate this." I gathered all the notes and samples we had, securing them in a radiation-proof container designed for field transport of hazardous biological materials. If nothing else survived, the formula for the mycological payload had to reach other resistance groups. The first visitor craft arrived 7 minutes later, hovering directly above our facility. We could feel its presence even underground, a pressure in the air, a subtle distortion of space that made my vision blur at the edges. They were scanning for us, preparing to extract or eliminate the threat to their network. "Keep transmitting until the last possible moment," I told Zhang. "Every second buys more time for the payload to spread." He nodded grimly, his hands steady on the controls despite the growing danger. The communication node was failing rapidly now, parts of it becoming transparent as its structure broke down at the molecular level. But it was still transmitting, still delivering our fungal weapon to the heart of the visitor network. The extraction team arrived just as the facility's outer defenses were breached. We could hear the distinctive sound of their specialized weapons engaging the visitor craft above. Colonel Vance's voice came through the comm system, tense but controlled. "Package secure, ready for immediate extraction." We abandoned the transmitter, which was now little more than a glowing outline of its former self, and moved quickly to the emergency exit where the extraction team waited with an armored transport. As we emerged, I saw them. Actual visitors, not just their craft or technology. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, their forms seeming to shift between solid and something less defined. They weren't wearing environmental suits or armor, they were the technology, their bodies inseparable from the machines they created. One of them turned toward me, and I felt a pressure in my mind, an attempt at communication or control, pushing against my consciousness like fingers probing for a weakness. For a brief, terrifying moment, I sensed something ancient and cold, a mind so alien that even its most basic assumptions about reality differed from my own. They didn't see us as enemies, or even as threats. We were simply resources, raw material to be harvested and repurposed, no different from the metals they extracted from our cities. The moment broke as one of the extraction team fired directly at the visitor, using one of the specialized weapons. The entity's form destabilized, parts of it seeming to fold inward through dimensions I couldn't perceive. The mental pressure vanished, and I was being pulled into the transport, the doors sealing behind us as we accelerated away from the facility. Through the observation ports, I watched as the entire mining complex collapsed inward, either from visitor attack or some self-destruct mechanism triggered by our retreat. Either way, it buried any evidence of our work there, denying the visitors direct access to our methods. "Did we succeed?" I asked as the transport raced toward the fallback position, weaving between hills to avoid detection from above. "Partially," Colonel Vance replied, showing me updated battle data on his tablet. "Their network is severely compromised in the Denver sector. The construction has halted, and we're seeing similar disruptions at other sites worldwide where resistance groups implemented the same attack simultaneously. But they're already beginning to establish isolation protocols around affected areas. They're learning, adapting. It wasn't the decisive victory we'd hoped for, but it was something. The first significant setback the visitors had experienced since their emergence. We had found a vulnerability and exploited it. More importantly, we had freed thousands of conscripted humans from visitor control. That alone made the operation worthwhile. The transport brought us to a secondary base established in what had once been a missile silo, now repurposed as a combined research and command center. It was smaller than the Helena facility but more secure, built to withstand nuclear strikes during the Cold War. Here, scientists and military personnel from around the region had gathered to coordinate resistance efforts. Dr. Okafor immediately set about sharing our findings with the research team, while Zhang worked with communications specialists to develop more resilient transmission methods for future attacks. I found myself summoned to a high-security briefing with Colonel Vance and several senior officials I didn't recognize. The briefing room was austere, dominated by a large digital display showing real-time data on visitor activities worldwide. The pattern was clear. They were regrouping, focusing resources on protecting their remaining construction sites while abandoning less critical areas. Our attack had forced them to prioritize, which meant we now had a clearer picture of their objectives. The mycological payload was more effective than we dared hope, Vance began, but it's only bought us time, not victory. We need to understand what they're building and why, if we're going to stop them permanently. One of the officials, a woman who introduced herself only as Director Foster, took over. Based on the data you recovered from Project Harbinger and what we've observed since the emergence, we believe the visitors have been in a dormant state beneath the Earth's surface for an extremely long time. The anomalies detected were essentially their hibernation chambers, protected by technology that kept them phased slightly out of our reality. She continued, explaining that the nuclear strikes had disrupted these protective fields, forcing the visitors fully into our dimension. They weren't expecting to awaken yet. Their emergence was premature, triggered by our weapons rather than by whatever signal they were waiting for. That's why their initial harvesting operations seem so urgent. They're gathering resources to complete their original plan despite the unscheduled awakening. The implications were staggering. These weren't invaders in the conventional sense. They had been here all along, waiting for some cosmic timer to run down or signal to arrive. We had inadvertently disrupted their schedule, which might explain why our relatively primitive fungal weapon had been effective. Their systems weren't fully prepared for active defense. The circular structures, Director Foster explained, appear to be a combination of energy collection arrays and what we believe are dimensional anchors, technology designed to stabilize a connection between our reality and somewhere else. They're not building launch facilities. They're building arrival sites. A chill ran through me as I processed what she was saying. The visitors weren't an invasion force. They were an advance party, preparing Earth for the arrival of something much larger. The mycological payload had disrupted their timetable, but it hadn't changed their fundamental objective. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Based on their current rate of construction and resource collection, we estimate 4 to 6 weeks before the first anchors are operational," she replied. "Less if they manage to accelerate their adaptation to our fungal weapon. 4 to 6 weeks to find a more permanent solution, to develop weapons or defenses that could actually defeat the visitors rather than merely slow them down." It wasn't much time, but it was something. And we now had a crucial advantage. We understood their purpose and timeline. As the briefing concluded, I realized that my role had fundamentally changed. I had started this crisis as a wildlife disease specialist tracking unusual animal behavior. Now I was at the center of humanity's resistance against an alien threat that had been hiding beneath our feet for who knew how long. My expertise in tracking disease vectors and developing countermeasures had proven unexpectedly vital. It would continue to be so in the desperate weeks ahead. The missile silo had been converted into a remarkable research facility in the hours after the Denver operation. Scientists from various disciplines worked side by side, analyzing data and developing new countermeasures. My experience with the mycological payload had earned me a position on the primary research team focused on biological weapons against the visitors. We had proven that terrestrial biology could affect their technology. Now, we needed to weaponize that knowledge more effectively. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Among the conscripted humans rescued from Denver was a microbiologist named Dr. Samuel Rivera, who had been working on experimental phage therapy before being captured. When he regained consciousness and learned what had happened, he immediately requested to join our research efforts. The nanoparticles they use behave remarkably like viruses, he explained during our first meeting. They infiltrate host systems, hijack cellular machinery, and replicate using local resources. If we approach them as viral infections rather than as traditional technology, we might develop more effective countermeasures. This perspective shift proved invaluable. Instead of trying to attack the visitor's technology directly, we began developing what Rivera called anti-phage therapies, biological agents specifically designed to target and neutralize the nanoparticles in infected humans and animals. The cordyceps fungus had been effective because it happened to produce compounds that degraded the alien metals. With deliberate engineering, we could create something far more potent. While we worked, military operations continued worldwide. The partial success at Denver had been replicated at several other construction sites, slowing the visitors' progress but not stopping it. They were adapting rapidly, developing countermeasures to our fungal weapon and establishing more robust isolation protocols in their networks. The timeline Director Foster had given us, 4 to 6 weeks before the first dimensional anchors became operational, was looking increasingly optimistic. 3 days into our research at the missile silo, we received word that a major visitor harvesting operation was heading our way. They hadn't located our facility yet, but they were systematically extracting resources from the surrounding region. We would soon be in their path. Colonel Vance called an emergency meeting to discuss evacuation options. The research was too important to risk, but moving would set us back days or even weeks. As we debated, Dr. Rivera proposed a radical alternative. "What if we don't run?" he suggested. "What if we use this as an opportunity to test our new anti-phage therapy in the field?" The therapy he was referring to was still experimental, a combination of engineered bacteriophages and modified fungal compounds designed to target the specific molecular structure of the visitor nanoparticles. We had seen promising results in laboratory tests using samples from rescued conscripts, but field deployment was at least weeks away in our original timeline. "It's risky," I argued. "We don't know how the visitors will respond to a direct biological attack, and the therapy hasn't been fully tested." "We don't have weeks," Rivera countered, "and they're coming whether we're ready or not. This might be our best chance to gather field data on their response to a new weapon." After intense debate, Colonel Vance made the decision. We would accelerate development of the anti-phage therapy and prepare for deployment against the approaching harvesting operation. Half the research team would evacuate with our existing data and samples as a precaution, while the rest of us would remain to conduct what amounted to a dangerous field experiment. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic work. We refined the therapy, produced it in quantity, and developed delivery systems that could disperse it effectively against both visitor technology and conscripted humans. The goal was twofold: disrupt the visitors' harvesting operation and potentially free more conscripts from their control. By the time our sensors detected the harvesting operation within 10 miles of our location, we were as ready as we could be. Observation drones showed us the approaching force, 3 triangular craft coordinating the movements of approximately 100 conscripted humans who were systematically dismantling an abandoned mining town for specific resources. Our plan was to deploy the antiphage therapy in 3 stages. First, a wide dispersal aerosol to saturate the area. Second, targeted delivery via modified drones to the conscripted humans. And third, direct application to any visitor entities that might be present. Colonel Vance's security team would provide protection while the science team monitored results and gathered data. The operation began at dawn. Weather conditions were ideal for aerosol dispersal, with light wind carrying the therapy directly toward the harvesting operation. Through observation drones, we watched as the invisible cloud of engineered phages and fungal compounds descended on the area. The initial effects were subtle but encouraging. The conscripted humans began to show minor disruptions in their coordinated movements, slight hesitations, occasional missteps. The triangular craft appeared unaffected at first, continuing their systematic scanning and resource identification. Phase 2 commenced 30 minutes later. The modified drones approached the harvesting operation, targeting individual conscripts with concentrated doses of the therapy. This produced more dramatic results. Several conscripts stopped working entirely, some collapsing to the ground while others stood motionless, as if frozen between commands. The visitors responded immediately to this more obvious threat. 2 of the triangular craft broke from their harvesting pattern and began scanning for the source of the disturbance. They detected our drones quickly, neutralizing them with pinpoint energy discharges that left nothing but falling ash. But it was too late. The therapy had been delivered and its effects were spreading among the conscripted workforce. More than half were now incapacitated, leaving the harvesting operation severely undermanned. The visitor craft began emitting focused energy patterns that seemed designed to stabilize the nanoparticles in the affected conscripts, but our therapy was specifically engineered to resist such countermeasures. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the triangular craft landed, and a visitor entity emerged. The first time we had observed one voluntarily leaving the protection of their vessels in daylight. It moved among the fallen conscripts, touching each one briefly. Where it touched, the conscripts would either rise and resume working, though with noticeably impaired coordination, or remain motionless. It appeared to be sorting them, determining which could still be useful. This was an unprecedented opportunity to observe visitor behavior directly. Through our remaining drones, we recorded detailed footage of the entity's movements and interactions. Its form was still difficult to define precisely, shifting between solid and something more fluid, with an iridescence that hurt the eyes when observed too long. But its actions were purposeful and methodical, suggesting an intelligence operating according to clear protocols. Dr. Rivera was particularly focused on the conscripts that the visitor rejected, those it touched but left on the ground. "It's triaging," he said, "determining which hosts are salvageable. That means the nanoparticles in the others are too compromised to repair quickly. The therapy is working." The third phase of our plan called for direct application of the therapy to any visitor entities present. This was the most dangerous part, requiring close proximity to deliver what amounted to a biological weapon against their actual forms, not just their technology. Colonel Vance had assembled a small strike team equipped with therapy dispersal devices disguised as conventional weapons. I argued against proceeding with Phase 3. We've already gathered valuable data, and we've significantly disrupted their operation. Engaging directly might reveal our location and bring overwhelming force down on us. But Colonel Vance saw a strategic opportunity we couldn't pass up. We need to know if this therapy affects them directly, not just their technology and conscripts. This may be our only chance to test that before the anchors are completed. The strike team moved out, approaching the harvesting site from multiple directions to divide the visitors' attention. I monitored their progress with Dr. Rivera through drone footage, every muscle tense as they closed in on their target. The visitor entity continued its methodical assessment of fallen conscripts, apparently unaware of the approaching threat. The first team member reached deployment range and activated his dispersal device. A concentrated cloud of the anti-phage therapy engulfed the visitor entity before it could react. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the entity's form began to fluctuate more rapidly, parts of it seeming to lose cohesion. It emitted a high-frequency pulse that our instruments registered, but human ears couldn't detect, some kind of distress signal or warning to others of its kind. The remaining triangular craft responded immediately, descending toward the compromised entity. The strike team fell back as ordered, having delivered the therapy successfully. Through the drones, we watched as the affected visitor was taken back aboard one of the craft, which then rapidly ascended and departed the area. The remaining craft followed shortly after, abandoning the harvesting operation entirely. They had left behind nearly 80 conscripted humans in various states of recovery or incapacitation. We had disrupted a major harvesting operation, tested our new therapy in the field with promising results, and potentially discovered a direct vulnerability in the visitors themselves. It was the most significant victory since the Denver operation, and it had occurred right on our doorstep without revealing our location. As recovery teams moved in to secure the area and evacuate the freed conscripts, I felt a cautious optimism for the first time since the crisis began. We had weapons that worked. We had strategies that could succeed. Most importantly, we had evidence that despite their advanced technology, the visitors were not invulnerable. Their biology, or whatever passed for it in their shifted state of reality, could be affected by terrestrial biological agents specifically engineered to target them. The conscripted humans we rescued provided invaluable information. As they recovered from visitor control, fragments of awareness during their captivity emerged. Most described the experience as being trapped in their own bodies, aware but unable to influence their actions. Some, however, reported brief glimpses of the visitor's consciousness bleeding through the nanoparticle connection, flashes of alien thought patterns and objectives. Dr. Rivera interviewed each rescued conscript extensively, compiling their fragmented insights into a disturbing picture. The visitors weren't just preparing arrival sites, they were transforming Earth's biosphere at a fundamental level. The conscripts who had worked closest to the central construction sites described witnessing the creation of strange biomechanical interfaces, living technology that could bridge the gap between our reality and wherever the visitors had originally come from. "They're not just building doorways," Dr. Rivera explained during our research briefing. "They're reshaping our entire ecosystem to make it compatible with theirs. The radiation they're manipulating, the specific resources they're harvesting, it's all part of a comprehensive terraforming operation." This aligned with my own observations about the perfectly circular clearings I'd seen from the beginning, areas where not just human structures but all terrestrial biology had been systematically removed and replaced with alien equivalents. It wasn't random destruction or simple resource extraction, it was calculated replacement. Among the rescued conscripts was a familiar face, the park ranger, Marshall, whom I'd met shortly after the initial nuclear exchange. He had been captured during a visitor sweep of the emergency shelter where he'd taken the family we encountered. His recovery from the nanoparticle control was more complete than most, perhaps due to some natural resistance or because he'd been conscripted more recently. "They're ancient," he told me when we spoke privately. "That's what I felt when they were in my head. They've done this before, many times, on many worlds. We're just the latest." Marshall also confirmed something I'd suspected based on the Project Harbinger documents. The visitors had been dormant beneath Earth for millennia, not just years or decades. They had arrived long before human civilization, embedding themselves deep in the planet's crust in a state of suspended animation, waiting for specific cosmic conditions or signals to reawaken. They see time differently than we do, he explained. For them, sleeping for 50,000 years is like a short nap. They've been patient, waiting for the right moment. Our nuclear weapons force them to accelerate their timetable. This information changed our strategic thinking. If the visitors had been on Earth longer than humanity itself, then their understanding of our planet's biology and geology would be comprehensive. Yet they still showed vulnerability to certain terrestrial organisms like the cordyceps fungus. This suggested they had either evolved away from compatibility with Earth's biosphere during their long absence, or they had never been fully compatible to begin with. 5 days after our successful field test, we received a transmission from a resistance cell operating near what had once been Chicago. They had observed unusual visitor activity, a massive gathering of triangular craft and conscripted humans around what appeared to be a medical research facility that had been converted to visitor use. Unlike other harvesting or construction operations, this one seemed focused on a single building, with resources being brought in rather than extracted. "They're researching something," Dr. Okafor concluded after reviewing the transmitted footage. "Most likely our anti-phage therapy. They're trying to develop countermeasures." This was both concerning and validating. The visitors considered our biological weapons threatening enough to divert significant resources toward neutralizing them. It confirmed we were on the right track, but it also meant our advantage might be temporary. Colonel Vance saw an opportunity in this development. If they're concentrating resources on research, their other operations might be vulnerable. We could coordinate simultaneous strikes at multiple construction sites while their attention is divided. The plan that emerged was ambitious: a coordinated global assault on 5 major construction sites, using both conventional military forces and our biological weapons. The missile silo facility would serve as command center for the North American operation, while resistance groups on other continents would target sites in their regions. If successful, we could set back the visitors' timeline by weeks or even months. Preparation for the operation consumed the next 36 hours. We mass-produced the anti-phage therapy, developed new delivery systems, and coordinated with military and resistance groups worldwide. I worked primarily on optimizing the therapy for maximum effect against visitor biology based on the data we'd gathered from the field test. The night before the operation was scheduled to begin, I found myself unable to sleep. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Millions of lives depended on the effectiveness of a biological agent I had helped develop, based on a random discovery of fungal resistance. As I paced the corridors of the missile silo, I encountered Director Foster in the communications center, reviewing the latest intelligence. "You should be resting," she said, though she looked as exhausted as I felt. "So should you," I replied. "But I keep thinking about something. The visitors have been here for thousands of years. They must have encountered Earth's biology before going dormant. Why would they be vulnerable to a fungus now if they weren't then?" Foster regarded me carefully before responding. "Perhaps they weren't vulnerable then. Perhaps they've changed during their dormancy, or perhaps Earth's biology has evolved in ways they didn't anticipate. Or perhaps they expected to wake up differently," I suggested, voicing the theory that had been forming in my mind. The nuclear strikes forced them to emerge prematurely. What if they were supposed to undergo some kind of adaptive process before fully engaging with our biosphere? Foster's expression changed subtly. "That would align with certain intelligence we've gathered." The Project Harbinger documents indicated cyclical energy fluctuations from the anomaly sites over the years, almost like maintenance cycles for suspended animation systems. We spent the next few hours reviewing all the data from both the Denver operation and our field test. looking for patterns that might support this theory. By morning, we had enough evidence to present to Colonel Vance and the research team. The visitors appeared to be operating at reduced capacity. Their technology, while still far beyond our own, showed inconsistencies and vulnerabilities that suggested incomplete functionality. They weren't ready to wake up, I explained to the assembled team. The nuclear strikes interrupted some crucial final preparation process. That's why our biological weapons have been effective. They're essentially fighting our biosphere without their full immune system in place. Dr. Rivera built on this theory with his own insights from the conscript interviews. Several subjects reported sensing frustration or urgency from the visitor consciousness, emotions we wouldn't expect from being so technologically advanced. They're improvising, trying to complete their mission despite suboptimal conditions. This perspective energized the team. If the visitors were operating at reduced capacity, scrambling to adapt to their premature awakening, then our coordinated strikes might have even greater impact than originally projected. We had caught them at their most vulnerable. The operation began at dawn, with simultaneous attacks on visitor construction sites across the globe. From the command center, we monitored the North American strike on what had once been Seattle, now transformed into one of the largest circular structures on the continent. Military forces engaged visitor defenses with weapons modified to penetrate their shielding, while specialized teams deployed the anti-phage therapy through various delivery systems. Initial reports were encouraging. The visitors seemed caught off guard by the scale and coordination of the attack. Their responses were fragmented, lacking the unified defense they had shown in earlier engagements. The therapy was dispersing effectively, degrading their technology and freeing conscripted humans from control. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded according to plan. Then something changed. A new type of visitor craft appeared above the Seattle site, larger than the triangular vessels, with a configuration that suggested different functionality. It emitted a powerful energy pulse that temporarily disabled our communications and scanning systems. When they came back online, we saw that the visitor defense had become more coordinated and effective. "They've deployed some kind of command and control node," Colonel Vance said, studying the tactical displays. "They're adapting faster than anticipated." Reports from other strike locations showed similar developments. The visitors were bringing new resources to bear, technologies we hadn't observed before. They were accelerating their adaptation, learning from our tactics in real time. Despite these countermeasures, the operation was still succeeding in its primary objectives. The construction sites had sustained significant damage, and thousands of conscripted humans had been freed from control. But the cost was higher than projected, with heavy casualties among the assault forces. As the operation entered its final phase, we received an unexpected transmission from the Chicago Resistance Cell. They had infiltrated the research facility where the visitors had been concentrating resources and discovered something alarming. The visitors weren't just researching countermeasures to our biological weapons. They were developing a biological weapon of their own, something designed to affect human neurological systems directly. "They're learning from us," Dr. Okafor said grimly, "using our own tactics against us." The implications were chilling. If the visitors could develop a biological agent tailored to human biology as effectively as we had targeted theirs, the next phase of the conflict would escalate to a new level of danger. We needed to neutralize this threat immediately, before they could deploy it. Colonel Vance quickly authorized a secondary operation targeting the Chicago Research Facility. A specialized strike team equipped with our most advanced anti-phage therapy was dispatched to destroy the facility and any biological weapons being developed there. I volunteered to join them, arguing that my expertise would be crucial in identifying and neutralizing the visitor bioweapon. "This is extremely high risk," Vance warned me. "We've just hit them hard across multiple sites. They'll be on high alert." "Which is why they won't expect another strike so soon," I countered. "And If they deploy their bioweapon before we can stop it, everything we've accomplished will be at risk. My request was approved, and within the hour I was aboard a stealth transport heading toward Chicago with a 12-person strike team. As we departed, the coordinated strikes were concluding with mixed results. Significant damage to visitor operations, but higher than expected casualties on our side. We had hurt them, but they had adapted quicker than we projected. The war was entering a new phase, with biological weapons becoming the primary battlefield. The flight to Chicago took less than 2 hours in the modified stealth transport. Captain Reyes, who led the strike team, briefed us on the approach. The research facility had once been the Midwest Regional Center for Disease Control. A cruel irony that the visitors would choose a human disease research center to develop their biological weapons against us. Satellite imagery shows minimal external defenses, Reyes explained. They're relying on secrecy rather than fortification. That works in our favor, but expect heavy internal security, including conscripted humans and possibly visitor entities. Our plan was straightforward but dangerous. Infiltrate the facility, identify the bioweapon research, collect samples if possible, and destroy everything else. The team carried specialized charges designed to contaminate biological samples with compounds that would render them useless without risking wider environmental release. As we approached Chicago, the devastation below became visible even through cloud cover. The city had been one of the first hit during the initial nuclear exchange, though we now knew the strikes had targeted visitor hibernation chambers rather than the city itself. The once iconic skyline was partially transformed, with alien crystalline structures rising among the remaining human architecture. We landed 3 miles from the target in what had once been a city park, now a bare circular clearing like the ones I'd seen from the beginning. Moving on foot to avoid detection, we approached the research facility from the south, using damaged buildings and strange new growth as cover. The facility itself appeared largely intact, a 5-story concrete structure with the CDC logo still visible on its facade. But the surrounding grounds had been transformed. Perfectly circular patterns of alien vegetation surrounded the building, creating concentric rings that pulsed faintly with bioluminescence. Between these rings moved conscripted humans in methodical patterns, carrying samples and equipment between the facility and small triangular structures that served as field laboratories. They've integrated the building into their biological systems, I observed, studying the scene through specialized optics. See how the alien growth connects directly to the foundation? They're using the existing structure but modifying it to suit their needs. Captain Reyes identified a maintenance entrance on the west side with minimal activity. We waited for a pattern gap in the conscript movements, then moved swiftly across the open ground. The specialized protective gear we wore incorporated elements of the anti-phage therapy, designed to mask our biological signatures from visitor detection systems. The maintenance entrance was unlocked, unnecessary since conscripted humans followed only direct commands rather than their own initiative. Inside, the facility was illuminated by the same bioluminescent growth that had covered the grounds, casting everything in a pale blue light. The interior architecture was human, but the equipment and materials being used were clearly alien, organic-looking interfaces grafted onto conventional laboratory equipment. We moved carefully through the lower levels, avoiding conscripted workers who moved with mechanical precision through their assigned tasks. None showed any awareness of our presence. Using handheld scanners calibrated to detect the specific energy signatures of visitor technology, we mapped our way toward what appeared to be the central research area on the 3rd floor. What we found there exceeded our worst expectations. The entire floor had been converted into a massive bioengineering laboratory where conscripted human scientists worked under visitor direction. Suspended in transparent cylinders were what appeared to be hybridized biological samples, partly human, partly alien tissue, pulsing with artificial life. Surrounding these were more conventional laboratory setups where tests were being conducted on what looked disturbingly like human subjects. I approached one of the workstations, careful to avoid detection by the conscripted researcher focused intently on her task. The display showed molecular structures I recognized as neurotoxins, but with modifications that would target specific human neurological pathways. They were developing something that would affect human brain function without killing, a control mechanism more elegant than their current nanoparticle technology. "They're not just creating a weapon," I whispered to Captain Reyes. "They're developing a more efficient conscription method, something that works through atmospheric dispersal rather than direct contact." The implications were horrifying. If they succeeded, they could convert entire populations simultaneously, without the resource-intensive individual conscription process they currently used. Combined with their accelerating construction of the dimensional anchors, this would give them the workforce needed to complete their preparations before resistance forces could intervene. While the team began placing charges at key points throughout the laboratory, I downloaded as much research data as possible from the systems. The visitors had interfaced their technology with human computer systems, creating hybrid networks that were difficult to navigate but not impossible for someone with the right equipment. We were nearly finished when the alarm came. Not a conventional security alert, but a shift in the bioluminescent patterns throughout the facility, pulsing in rapid sequences that triggered immediate responses from the conscripted workers. They all turned simultaneously toward the central laboratory where we were operating, then began moving in coordinated patterns to surround and contain us. "They've detected us," Reyes announced. "Execute final placements and prepare for extraction." The remaining charges were quickly set while the team established a defensive perimeter. The conscripted workers weren't armed in the conventional sense, but their numbers and coordination made them dangerous nonetheless. They moved with single-minded purpose, attempting to overwhelm us through sheer mass rather than tactical approach. More concerning was the arrival of what appeared to be specialized security conscripts, humans enhanced with visible visitor technology grafted directly to their bodies. These moved faster than regular conscripts and showed evidence of tactical thinking rather than simple directive following. "They're evolving their methods," I noted as we engaged these enhanced threats, creating specialized roles for different conscript types. As we fought our way back toward the lower levels, I noticed something unexpected in the research data I downloaded: references to immune subjects and naturalized resistance. Scanning through the files while the team cleared our path, I found documentation of human subjects who had shown natural resistance to both the nanoparticle technology and the new neurotoxin being developed. This wasn't just valuable intelligence, it was potentially game-changing. If some humans possessed natural immunity to visitor control methods, we might be able to isolate the biological factors responsible and develop more effective countermeasures or even preventative treatments. We reached the ground floor under increasing pressure from conscripted forces. Enhanced security conscripts had blocked our original entry point, forcing us to find an alternate route. Captain Reyes made the call to exit through the main entrance, which would expose us to more danger but offered a more direct path to our extraction point. As we prepared to make our move, I noticed a familiar face among the conscripted researchers being evacuated from the upper floors. Dr. Eliza Chen, my field partner who had disappeared at the beginning of the crisis. She was being escorted by enhanced conscripts, treated with obvious care compared to others. Something about her was valuable to the visitors. I made an instant decision that contradicted our mission parameters, but felt absolutely necessary. "We need to extract that researcher," I told Reyes, pointing out Eliza. "She's a CDC specialist who was studying the anomalies before all this happened. She might have critical information." Reyes assessed the situation quickly, then nodded. "Team 2, adjust extraction route to include high-value human asset. Prepare for additional passenger." The extraction became significantly more complex with this new objective. Team 2 broke off to intercept Eliza while the rest of us engaged the conscripted security forces at the main entrance. The anti-phage therapy integrated into our weapons proved effective against the enhanced conscripts, disrupting their augmentations and reducing their coordination. As the charges we'd placed began to detonate throughout the facility, creating cascading system failures in the visitor biotech, Team 2 rejoined us with Eliza. She was conscious but non-responsive, her eyes showing the metallic sheen of nanoparticle infestation. Unlike other conscripts, however, she didn't attempt to resist or escape. She simply followed where led, as if in a trance rather than under direct control. We fought our way clear of the facility as secondary explosions began to consume the structure. The visitor biotech, once destabilized, proved highly volatile, consuming both alien and human materials in what looked like accelerated decomposition. By the time we reached our extraction point, the entire research center was collapsing in on itself, the concentric rings of alien vegetation withering and dying as their central control systems failed. The return flight was tense but triumphant. We had accomplished our primary mission, destroying the visitor bioweapon research before it could be deployed, and secured 2 valuable assets: the research data I'd downloaded and Dr. Eliza Chen herself, who represented a unique opportunity to study long-term conscription effects. It wasn't until we were halfway back to the missile silo facility that Eliza spoke her first words since being extracted. They were not what any of us expected. "They're afraid," she said, her voice flat but distinctly her own. "For the first time in their existence, they face extinction." When I asked her to explain, she turned to me with eyes that still showed the metallic shimmer, but now seemed to contain awareness behind them. "The dimensional anchors aren't just for bringing more of them here," she said. "They're escape routes. Something is coming that threatens them as much as us, something they woke up too early to prepare for properly." This revelation changed everything. The visitors weren't just invaders, they were refugees, desperately trying to establish a foothold before some greater threat arrived. Our resistance wasn't just fighting for human survival, it was unwittingly preventing the visitors from preparing their own defenses against something worse. As we approached the missile silo facility, I pondered these implications. If Eliza was right, we faced an impossible choice: continue fighting the visitors at the risk of leaving Earth defenseless against a greater threat, or find some way to cooperate with beings who viewed us as little more than useful biological resources. The research data I'd recovered might hold answers, particularly regarding the naturally immune humans the visitors had been studying. If we could understand why some people resisted control, we might find leverage for negotiation rather than simple resistance. It wasn't much, but it was a direction, a potential path forward in a situation that had seemed increasingly hopeless. The facility came into view as dawn broke on what would be my 6th day since the nuclear exchange that started everything. In less than a week, I had gone from tracking wildlife diseases to fighting aliens and uncovering cosmic threats. The world had fundamentally changed, and so had I. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Humanity's greatest strength had always been our ability to adapt, to learn, to find solutions where none seemed possible. If we could maintain that ingenuity and determination, we still had a fighting chance, not just for survival, but for understanding what was really happening to our world. As I record this now from the relative safety of this mining shelter, I want whoever finds this to understand what we're really facing. This isn't just an alien invasion triggered by our nuclear weapons. It's something more complex, ancient beings awakened prematurely, desperately preparing for something they fear, using our planet and our people as resources in a struggle we barely comprehend. Find others like me. Find the naturally immune. Study the Cordyceps montana fungus that affects their technology. Most importantly, remember that we've already proven they can be fought, their plans disrupted, their technology compromised. They may have been here longer than us, but this is our world now, and we won't surrender it without exhausting every option, exploring every possibility, and fighting with everything we have. The first 48 hours were just the beginning. The real battle for Earth's future is still unfolding, and despite everything, I believe we can win.